I don't think Russia has that sort of... I don't think Russia was ever going to be some full-fledged kind of, reincarnation of America or something. It's not. It's just very different. But, a bit like India has its own version of democracy. Could we have seen that ever at any one point, or is it just too late now and it only depends on when Putin is out of the picture?
This reminds me, there's this great joke that every state has a mafia, but Russia's the only country where the mafia has its own state. And, that's what we're seeing in Russia. And that's, I think, the most appropriate way to look at the Russian government today is it's an organized criminal organization with nuclear weapons and massive oil wealth.
This is The Global Gambit.
No, 100%. And the goal with this show, with the podcast, is to, people will hear me, they'll look at me and they're like, oh, great, another Western trying to tell me what I should be doing with my life or the way my country should be run. And it's like, no, there are people in Western countries which I think are more aware that certain countries need to show more humility and a willingness to sort of take a step back and actually engage people where they are or on their level. And that doesn't mean in a patronizing sense. It just means that they're for too long. And I think this still exists, unfortunately. It still permeates much of DC, London, Brussels, perhaps, to an extent, in that there is still this sort of reluctance to want to sort of be a little bit more, just humble and sort of, not that you're not suddenly trying to push your interest or the idea that democracy is the best way to construct a state or society, but just sort of not so much with the presumption that people immediately will agree with us because we're from the West or something like this. I think there's a lot of policymakers who are very much stuck in this way, and it kind of goes back to what you're talking about very much at the beginning of the conversation, and sort of in the history, and we sort of thought that, there you go, West model, that's the best. Not so much. And with that in mind, let's bring in the Ukrainian symbolism of this, because, on one hand, we've got the Ukrainians fighting for their sovereignty to be an independent state against an entity which is very much not. Russia is supposed to be, in comparative politics terms, a semi-presidential republic, similar to that of France, audience, but it's not. And systemic opposition, which is the Communist Party, the Liberal Democratic Party, which is not Liberal Democratic, they're ultra-nationalists, and the third one, which I always forget, they agree with Putin's foreign policy no matter what. So he could say, let's go into Moldova. And I'm like, yes, we agree with that. I think it's quite weird that we have an ultra-nationalist party and a communist party agreeing with each other, unless it's all a little bit of a staging effort. I don't know, Uriel, I know I've said some random things there, but I do want you to jump in. Sort of what Russia and Ukraine's relationship to this whole democratic, autocratic tug of war we're in at the moment.
So, great. So let me try to sort of zoom out here a little bit and think about what Russia and Ukraine have to teach us about sort of the state of global democracy and the state of where we are now. So first and foremost, your point about Russia and these different parties aligning with each other. Yeah, I mean, it's total nonsense. I mean, it's total BS. I mean, there is no opposition in Russia anymore. It's all gone. All of this is perfectly stage managed. I mean, I was blown away by the fact that, again, on that previous conversation you and I were on, people were bringing up the Putin's election in Russia, where he won 87% of the vote, as evidence of how incredibly popular this man, Vladimir Putin, is. And, maybe there were some inconsistencies here and there, but ultimately, oh my God, look at this man's popularity. And of course, my joking response is I think he actually underperformed. I mean, usually Russian leaders like that would get 101 or 102% of the vote. I mean, it's kind of actually, to say that it's under 100% is kind of surprising. But the truth is that there's no actual opposition in Russia. Any real opponents, like my friend and colleague Gary Kasparov and others, are either killed or in exile. They don't stay. They cannot stay in Russia anymore. So that's number one. I think that's an important point. Now, as for the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, one of the things that people like to point to is that Ukraine isn't all that different from Russia in their view, right? Like the opponents of our support for Ukraine will say, this is just a border dispute. Ukraine is no less corrupt. It's no less anti-democratic and so forth than Russia. And I think that's a terrible argument. I think that's ridiculous on its face, but I think it demonstrates sort of this historical ignorance of the nature of the Russian-Ukrainian relationship. And so I want to kind of go in here for just a moment in that, Russia and Ukraine were both a part of the Soviet Union. They were both, the borders between them in some ways were not something that was significant for many, many years. My father's from Moscow. My mother's from Kiev. At home, we spoke only in Russian. My mother doesn't even remember Ukrainian. She can understand it. She cannot speak it. And, Ukraine was notoriously corrupt and there was anti-Semitism. Again, so I want to say like those flaws were, and note my use of the past tense, those flaws were an important part of Ukrainian history. However, things in Ukraine shifted. And the two countries didn't just divide and go their separate ways when the Soviet Union fell in 1991. In my view, where they actually went their separate ways was in 1990, when there was a presidential election in Ukraine and the incumbent lost the election. And I should note, by the way, that the incumbent was friendly to the West, and the challenger who won the election was friendly to Russia. And there was a peaceful transfer of power. The incumbent walked away and handed the reins of power to the challenger, even though, again, the challenger was friendlier to Russia than he was to the West. That is where the two countries went their separate ways. There has never been a peaceful and democratic transfer of power in Russia. It has never happened in history, not even in the 90s. In Ukraine, it happened in 1994, and that started Ukraine down this path of increasing democratization, increasing reforms, and so forth. Even though corruption remained a big problem in Ukraine, the Ukraine has made tremendous efforts to combat that corruption, to get away from it, to combat the anti-Semitism that was a component of Ukraine. They've done all of these things. And the reason ultimately that Putin invaded in 2020 wasn't because of any nonsense around fear of NATO expansion or some Nazis in Kiev. No, I mean, all of that, of course, was total nonsense. The reason he invaded was because he could not allow a successful, democratic, in a large way, Russian-speaking country on his border, because that could show the Russian people what might be possible. And that was the direction that Ukraine was trending. And so what this conflict teaches us is is it possible, right? Or what it will show us, the conclusion of this conflict will show us, is it possible for a less powerful country to choose to chart its own course away from authoritarianism, away from corruption, towards the free world? Or are they going to be doomed to be subjugated by dictators who will stop at nothing to maintain their own power?
Oh dear, you've got me thinking about what could have been sometimes. No, I appreciate that, being half Russian English, although my grandmother's family actually, as far as my father's told me, is Don Cossack. So we have a heritage that comes from that Donbass area. And so this does lead me a little bit to another question, though, which is one of the things that I don't want to say pro-Putin, but sort of Putin apologist types will say is that even if Ukraine is, quite Western in other parts, there is a large proportion of Russians in Donetsk and Luhansk in Eastern Russia which do want to be part of the country, or they want to be not dominated by they're seeing their rights reduced under the Ukrainian government. Their ability to practice Russian Orthodoxy was removed under the Zelensky government. And so this leads on to then the argument that Ukraine should have always just been neutral, and they should have adopted an Austrian model, or gone through Finlandization, this sort of thing. But that's not possible, because Putin would never have been satisfied with that, and he would have wanted to be more Russia orientated. Or is that I know that's a very simplistic interpretation, but we're trying to condense many years of history into sort of 2 minutes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is a really interesting question. So first, let me say that, of course, Putin would never have been satisfied with that, right? We saw that from the very beginning of the invasion. He went straight for Kiev, with countless tanks, with special forces units and so forth. And he actually assumed that there would be no opposition to him, that he would be greeted with flowers on the streets, especially in overwhelmingly Russian-speaking areas like Kharkiv, and others. And so he thought that his tanks could roll on through. And in fact, they found parade uniforms in, dead Russian soldiers' belongings, basically expecting that they'd be walking down Kreshchatyk, right, the central street in Kiev, celebrating the Russian victory. Of course, that didn't happen. But what that shows us is two key things. Number one, that, and just those regions that he annexed, it was all of Ukraine, right? He didn't just go for those regions. He went directly for Kiev, expecting that Kiev would fall within 4 days, which, by the way, I should note the CIA also expected. The CIA gave Kiev 96 hours. The second piece that I think this demonstrates is that Russian speakers were in fact willing to fight. I mean, this whole idea that Russian speakers are going to inherently be sympathetic to Russia and want to be a part of Putin's authoritarian government is flawed because it's not true, right? The president of Ukraine today, Vladimir Zelensky, is a native Russian speaker. He primarily spoke Russian. In fact, there's an incredibly amusing video from like a little over a decade ago, I think, of him dancing at a Russian New Year celebration and singing and dancing and performing. And then there's Vladimir Solovyov, the primary Russian propagandist, dancing along with him. And it's just this surreal video that you couldn't believe. And if you haven't seen it, I'm happy to share it with you. And so, you know, again, this idea that the Russian language is the thing that binds people of Ukraine to Russia is fundamentally flawed. And again, I see it in my own family, right? Like, I am a native Russian speaker. I do not speak Ukrainian. My mother, who's from Kiev, does not speak Ukrainian, only Russian. And yet there's absolutely no question as to which country she affiliates with more. And I think that's true of a lot of folks in Russia. Where you saw incredible opposition to the Russian invasion from overwhelmingly Russian-speaking countries, cities, and regions. So that's number one. That's key, or rather number two, the key kind of challenge to the premise that you put forth. Additional components here that I think we should. Well, all right. So doubling back for just a moment, I want to note one amusing thing which you noted in your introduction, which was that Ukraine should go through Finlandization, right? Which is a very interesting concept now that Finland has joined NATO. And that's something, I joked about this early on in the war, right? Because people were saying, okay, well, Ukraine should just be like Finlandization, they should be neutral and so forth. And of course, as soon as Russia invades, Finland immediately tries to join NATO, and of course, as of fairly recently, they've officially joined. And now, as amusing and as this might be, it actually, I think, shows us something. It shows us that even the most neutral countries in the world, right, like the country whose very names have become synonymous with neutrality, right, like Finland, are nevertheless threatened by authoritarian regimes, and ultimately, when they see that threat arise, they want to join the free world, not only economically, but also militarily. And that's what I think Finland's accession to NATO demonstrates. And that's why I think talking about the Finlandization of Ukraine is actually very appropriate, because perhaps in an alternative universe, right, where the government of Russia isn't this incredibly imperialistic, aggressive, authoritarian state, perhaps a neutral Ukraine might have been an option. But in a world where dictators are uniting with one another and supporting one another and are actively on the march against the free world, there is no choice. And so when we talk about the Finlandization of Ukraine, what we're actually talking about today is the ultimate future accession of Ukraine to NATO as the only ultimate guarantee of its long-term security.
Yes, that's a pretty, I think, difficult topic, and maybe one that we can have you back to talk about in the future. But there was one thing I wanted to delve into more specifically, which is you're talking about the imperialistic nature of this current, well, should we just say regime, not government in Russia. What would it take for Russia to become a democracy? And let's be more specific here, or at least more democratic. Not necessarily, I don't think Russia has that sort of, I don't think Russia was ever going to be some full-fledged kind of, reincarnation of America or something. It's not. It's just very different. But, a bit like India has its own version of democracy. Could we have seen that ever at any one point? Or is it just too late now and it only depends on when Putin is out of the picture?
This reminds me, there's this great joke that every state has a mafia. But Russia is the only country where the mafia has its own state. And, that's what we're seeing in Russia. And that's, I think, the most appropriate way to look at the Russian government today is it's an organized criminal organization with nuclear weapons and massive oil wealth. That's what we're seeing in Russia, which in some ways, people talk about oil and other natural resources of that way being a double-edged sword. And I think we've seen that in Russia where, the rise in the price of oil in the early 2000s, where the price of oil skyrocketed, gave Putin an overwhelming amount of popularity among the Russian people because they there was a correlation, right, between Putin's accession to power and the rise in the price of oil, right, which was one of the key things that kind of propped up the Russian economy. And unfortunately, there were no democratic institutions in Russia at that time. Let me rephrase that. There were no established democratic institutions in Russia at that time, which could limit the power of the executive. And so you saw a kind of literal, almost visualization of the phrase that, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's what we saw in Russia. Do I think there was ever a chance for democracy? Yes. I think there was a brief glimmer of hope in the 90s, but unfortunately there were a couple of things that happened in the 90s that led to a massive failure. The first was that the West walked away. Right? 1991 happens, the Soviet Union falls, you have people like Jeffrey Sachs and a few others parachute into Russia and basically feed them bitter medicine of privatization without sort of an effective economic transition period and without kind of rule of law. So you saw simultaneous massive inflation, people's money being worthless, people not being able to buy loaves of bread, while you also saw the proliferation of actual organized crime, not just the organized crime that the Russian government is, but like just, traditional organized crime in the way that we would see in like the movies like Gangs of New York. And so people look at the 90s as, in Russian, I'm sure you've heard the expression, the wild, wild 90s. And unfortunately, tragically, they associate that lawlessness with democracy when the two should not necessarily be associated. So that was a key failure, in my view, of Russia's growth over time. So then back to your question today. Well, what can be done? I think the number one thing, the single most important thing that can be done in order for Russia to actually become a free country is for Ukraine to win this war. I think a Ukrainian victory is the single best thing to happen for the Russian people. Let me explain. If Ukraine wins, that will be a significant exogenous shock to the Putin regime, to the mafia in power, right? Putin as the capa de tuta capi, the godfather of God, the ultimate godfather, boss of bosses. It'll be a massive blow to him, and I do not think it'll be a blow that he will be able to survive in the long term. And you will see in Russia, I think, a certain measure of instability, right? There's a risk associated with this, but I think it's a risk well worth taking, because only then will there be a chance for some kind of internal democratic renewal in Russia, because only then will people start looking for alternatives. When this sort of myth of Putin's invulnerability is pierced, only then can people like, Khodorkovsky, Kasparov, even Navalny's people, whomever else, right? Like, only then will the opposition even have a chance at success. And I'm not saying it's a guarantee, right? It's only the possibility, the opportunity of that chance happening. But, again, when we think about this war, we shouldn't think about it as a war between Ukraine and Russia. It really is a war between Ukraine and a dictatorial Russian regime, which places no value on the worth of Russian lives, right? They're willing to throw Russian troops as if they're worth absolutely nothing because, well, to them, they are worth nothing. And therefore, the sooner this war draws to a conclusion, the sooner we, once again, like we did in the 90s, have the smallest of chances to bring Russia back into the realm of the free world. And my last point that I want to make here is that I know that there are very powerful advisors to President Joe Biden, to other Western leaders that are actually afraid of this. They are afraid of Putin's fall and they want to prevent it. In some ways, they actually want to save the Putin regime, which in my view is an instance of strategic blindness. But they are so afraid of that in that period of instability that they're willing to do anything to prevent it. And my view right now is that, unfortunately, there will be risks no matter what, but the risks of having Putin in power indefinitely far outweigh the risks of having a period of instability in Russia. And so I think we should be willing to take that risk in order to avoid what, in my view, is sort of the inevitability of Putin's continued imperialism and continued threats to other countries in the free world.
Yeah, I mean, This was meant to be the winding down, and we close with these answers to the questions, but you're just instigating more questions. So this is oh dear, Uriel, like goodness me. But no, I think it's incredibly pertinent what you're saying. But it also leads me to, I guess, the actual last question, which, to be fair, was what I intended to leave with, which was that, you know, this has resulted in a largely big antithesis to Russia. There's not many people who like just Russia, period, right? What about your idea that Russia were to collapse or to fragmentize, Balkanize? You know, is this a realistic thing? And ultimately, do we want that or we don't? Do you think that there is a place for a more democratic role Russia in the world? And I'll summarize it as this, basically, which is that I interviewed or spoke with John Mearsheimer a couple of years ago at an event. I got to ask him a question. It was prior to February 24th. And I asked him very simply, what would it take for the United States and Russia to be more aligned? I didn't use the term allies because I think that's a little bit too far-fetched, at least in my lifetime, perhaps. But, you know, and his simple reply, being the realist that he is, the rise of China would push Russia towards the US gradually. Do you agree with that or not?
I don't think it'll shock you that Mr. Mearsheimer and I agree on very little. And I would in fact be describing him as a realist. I think that it's an insult to the term realist. And I think we actually see that I want to challenge two premises on this. So first, let me challenge his premise that the rise of China would push Russia closer to the US, because what we've seen today is actually the exact opposite. China has risen, and Putin, by invading Ukraine, has essentially tied himself to China. Putin, like Russia, is now officially a junior partner to China. There is no other way to look at it. Russia depends upon Chinese diplomatic protection and support. They depend on the Chinese to prop up their economy. They depend on the Chinese for a whole host of other things, including even some supplies to sort of prop up their military-industrial complex. And China has stopped short of providing Russia with fully lethal aid for the most part, I think, due to the unity of the free world, and we're truly winning. I'm not so sure that stop itself from continuing that support. But of course, China doesn't do that for free. They require loyalty and obeisance in return. And I think that's that's the position that Putin has put Russia into. So right now, far from Mearsheimer's original assessment that the rise of China would push Russia towards the West, Putin has been so focused on imperialism and so focused on wars of external aggression in order to distract the people from internal economic and other failures, that he has decided that aligning himself as the junior partner to China is more important than Russian prosperity, than Russian freedom of international travel, of international banking. So that's number one. The second premise I want to challenge in your question is this idea that Russia has become incredibly unpopular in the West. While I wish that were true, and again, I want to point out that it's not that I want Russia as a country to be unpopular, not at all. I personally, I'll be frank, I still take pleasure in listening to Tchaikovsky, and other things like that. But Russia, the Russian government, this genocidal, imperialistic entity that calls itself the government of Russia, it's that I believe more people should be incredibly threatened by and opposed to. But what we found is almost the reverse, where in certain segments of the free world, yes, obviously, the Russian government and Putin and so forth are anathema, but you've seen other pieces, especially the far right and the far left in a number of countries, being increasingly friendly to the Russian government and actively defending their interests. And they might couch their support of Russian interests by saying that they believe in, American isolationism, or focusing on the US, or ignoring the rest of the world, or, myths and conspiracy theories about Ukrainian Nazis and God knows what else, but they nevertheless will portray Putin as this defender of white Christendom. And Putin, I think, intelligently has leaned into this, right? He's said that he is opposing wokeism. He is combating the trans movement or whatever. And of course, what do those things have to do with the Russian-Ukrainian war? Nothing. Absolutely nothing, right? Like, they're totally irrelevant. But Putin has managed to find a way to inject himself into sort of these culture wars that we're having. And I think it speaks to the ill health of our own society that we've allowed this to happen, that we have allowed Kremlin conspiracies to penetrate so deeply into, among parts of the American people. As one specific example of this, I'll point out that I once met with, a member of Congress, a Republican member of Congress, and I won't be too specific. I won't say from which state, but, I met with a Republican member of Congress somewhere in the middle of the country. And he told us that, look, he personally is supportive of Ukraine, and he understands that this is a war for freedom and that Ukraine is on the front lines of freedom, but that people in his district watch Russia Today. They watch RT. I have no idea how RT made itself a significant source of news for people in middle America, but somehow they've succeeded. And so it is a testament to that propaganda that I have to challenge your second premise that Russia has become less popular among parts of the West today. And I think we obviously have to try to fight back against that. That's what I think I'll leave your viewers with, that, our job moving forward, as those in kind of the information space, is to explain why these are conspiracy theories, explain what is actually at stake in this war, and why supporting Ukraine is not some act of altruism, or some bleeding heart thing, or worse yet, a distraction. But it's something that is core to American interests, and it's core to the interests of the free world. I think I see that sort of as the key job that we have as we move forward.
Well, there you go. A nice sort of constructive, this is the job we've got to get done, let's go to it, guys, message to end on there. But thank you very much, everyone, for watching this part 2 with Uriel Epshtein. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. But as always, I wish you a peace of mind, and until next time.